Hello and welcome to the Danger Dungeon Encounter Podcast. I'm your host, the Lanky Paladin, Dungeon Master Chase. Today I'm very excited to be bringing you the creators of the new Scavenger setting. Scavenger is a brand new original apocalyptic fantasy setting that uses the open gaming license to take the 5th edition of the world's most popular role-playing game and turn it into something interesting and different. It's not a straight port of the 5e rules. It uses 5e as a foundation and makes minor changes to several aspects of the game. It also introduces some cool alternative rules in order to achieve its tones of a dying and harsh wasteland world. An open playtest was released earlier this year and is available for free. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. And just go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Okay, I'm Andy. I'm the artist and one of the world builders from Scavenger.
Hey, I'm Robert Adichie. I'm one of the world designers.
I'm Marquise. I'm also one of the world designers and writers, and I do a lot of the mechanical creation as well.
All right, fantastic. So if someone doesn't know exactly what Scavenger is and why it's so cool and why they should be getting into it, how would you pitch it to them?
The way I got introduced to it was, I think, a Dark Sun Discord. I was on there and I saw Andy in there, and Andy posted some of his art that, was kind of related to Dark Sun. It's got a very Dark Sun feel to it. That's a lot of the same things I like about Brahms' art in Dark Sun I liked about Andy's art. And so we just started talking about stuff, and Andy said that he wanted to kind of make an art book for it. And so we started talking about it, and we started talking about the world, and Andy already had a bunch of great ideas for this world, which was sort of dying, and this, it's not really post-apocalyptic, it's more like mid-apocalyptic. The apocalypse is happening, but nobody really knows why. And so we just kind of started talking. This was a couple of years ago now, and just kind of slowly morphed into, okay, well, let's actually do this thing.
Yeah, fantastic. And yeah, so you say like a lot of themes there. You're throwing around some words like post-apocalyptic and mid-apocalyptic and everything like that. And yeah, just looking at this stuff, you immediately get that Dark Sun feel for it. But what exactly is Scavenger? Like, what is the setting that we're getting into?
Yeah, so Scavenger is a two-part world, really. I say two-part world is kind of a lie. It's really like one main base world and then another world that branches out into a lot of Planescape-esque things. So you have this world called Akara, which is a Bronze Age locked world. A bunch of city-states in it is going through something called the Cataclysm or the Great Dying. This massive extinction event, these constant natural disasters. And there's a big theme of refugeeism in here, where basically all these cities are being destroyed. So you have a bunch of refugees moving to different places. And then in one place in particular, the city of Tarnak, there's this thing called the Monolith, which leads to the world torn apart, or torn for short, which is this really strange alien world that the Scavengers, which is the players, are going to and exploring and trying to find resources and either a way to stop the Great Dying or to save the people they love or to find a new place to live or something like that. And Torn is just, it's complete chaos. It's strange. There's nothing like it anywhere else in Akara. There's metals that don't exist. There's creatures that don't exist. And there's these things called shards, which is magic for the world. So you have this really alien, changing, weird place, and then these really weird people going into it and coming back and changing as they go back and forth.
Oh, they're changing as they go back and forth. So to like entering into the Tarn have effects on people?
It does. So part of what you get from the Torn or from Torn is you get these things called shards. And shards are these blood red gemstones, that are kind of like magical batteries of a way that you can use them for artifice to create things. So if you introduce that to a Bronze Age world, and they also have this weird radiation as well, you have these people who really have no idea what's going on and are slowly figuring things out through the science and the mysticism and being evolved and changed as a result of this. So how we decided to do it is that a lot of classes in 5e have very like magical abilities, like the barbarians, like rage, or like the just like sorcery abilities and all of that. And that stuff is not native to Akara because Akara has no actual magic on it. And so shards and their radiation are creating these abilities and this new science and the spellcraft and everything.
Yeah. So it's kind of like as a dungeon master, when you come into this setting, you automatically have this mega dungeon in the Torn world. But really, is that like when you go into that, can anything happen, or is it always the same thing when you go in? Or like to kind of describe that more, because the actual playtest doesn't get into it a whole bunch.
Mm-hmm. So it's not exactly like a mega dungeon. And if I do and Andy want to jump in, they can. But it's more like Imagine if Planescape, all the planes were just like on one level playing field, intermixing and changing, and then you kind of have what I envision Torn as, which Andy, because I think Andy can elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, it's sort of like pocket universe, I'd say. It's not fully explored.
Mhm.
So, and yeah, it's always changing. So you can find all strange things in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always visioned it as like this massive continent with no real bounds. So like, like a it's an infinite place, but we don't really know how far it goes. Like maybe it doesn't, we don't know. So I always just imagine sort of like a Ravenloft, like just this island in the mist sort of, and we don't know how big it is. And, we're just going to kind of go along with that and add things until we want to say there's some definitive end or not, so it's kind of unlimited, has room. So it's got these outdoor places. It all sort of seems outdoor, but there's also kind of dungeons and underground things. There's all kinds of things there.
Yeah. And it seems kind of like intentionally vague. Like we don't get any pictures of like the artifact yet, which I hope we're working on that, like to see what that looks like from Tarnak and stuff like this strange artifact, and like what looks like in the inside, because it kind of looks like you're just giving the dungeon masters just room to just run wild with their own imagination and come up with any cool stuff they want to put in there.
So Andy does have, we do have some art of the monolith. And there are some places that are drawn, and that was one of the things that also kind of drew me to Andy's art. It's got this sort of mystical, kind of soft light quality on a lot of things, and that really helped kind of bring the Torn, what we're calling Torn now, to life. Yeah.
So when you're not exploring this pocket dimension of Torn, what is the actual world, this dying world, like?
We compared it a lot initially to like Dark Sun, but it's not a desert world. A lot of the areas around where we have kind of the main map right now is sort of forested, although a lot of things are dying too. So, when a lot of plants or when a lot of animals die, then a lot of plants are going to start dying. And so it's sort of slowly dying, but it's still, somewhat forested and jungly in different parts. So it's as Marquis said, it's kind of like a Bronze Age world. So you have your city states and, people with wagons. And, but the thing is a lot of large animals are dying. So there's no really not a lot of horses or anything like that running around. So the world is in the midst of this apocalypse. Things are dying. So people are still trying to survive, not only because things are dying, then you have people turning to raiding just to survive. You have people turning to cannibalism to survive. And then on top of that, there's also these creatures called the Skren that are coming from rents in the earth, and they are sort of kind of like scorpion men. They're creatures, though they're not really intelligent, and so they're sort of coming. Nobody really knows what they are, and they're sort of devastating the land as well. So there's all these external issues that people are having, and so they're all sort of flooding the major cities, and then from there, a lot of people are moving on further to Tarnak to try to go into Torn to try to find a better place to live, to have their families survive.
Yeah, and build on a bit on what what Robert said about the about how the world looks different from Dark Sun. A lot of Andy's influences he pulled in. We have things like savannas. We have a lot of African inspiration, a lot of Middle Eastern and Indian inspiration. So when you look at the world and you look at the art, you don't really see the classical Western fantasy, and you don't really see the classical post-apocalyptic desert fantasy. But you have these sweeping browns and greens with these savannas that are dying off. A lot of the animals that exist in Akara itself don't actually exist in our world, and vice versa. So you don't have actual wolves or bears and stuff like that. You have really strange animals, a mixture of slightly prehistoric things to very prehistoric things. Things are just pure fantasy. So.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the things that jumped out at me right away. It was yes, you kind of have these bone, scavengers are in leather and these, bone armor and stuff like that. But you also have these really lush, beautiful places too, which, it kind of has this tragic element because it's all dying and going away. And you talked a little bit about refugees being a big theme in the Scavengers setting. And so that's not only refugees from this dying world, but refugees from this world where they're going to be going and trying to leave to go to other planes and things like this to find maybe a new home later.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're going with the whole refugee idea is it made sense to me that from a literary sense, Scavenger had the opportunity to kind of explore the refugee story, which I think is very relevant to like our current modern times as well. And so I was playing with the idea that we have these collapsing city states. These tribes can't live on their land anymore. These people have nowhere to go, and they all have to go somewhere. And so in the world of Akara itself, you have a lot of conflict before you even get into tone of dealing with the sudden overpopulation in some of these cities, or fighting people along the road, or saving people along the road who need saving, or trying to go and save people from places that you're coming from, and that kind of thing. So it kind of also ties in the tragedy that you just mentioned. That you have these really beautiful areas, but the people can't even really live there for much longer, if any longer at all.
So a fantasy setting isn't really like complete unless you have like a big baddie. And it looks like the baddie that you guys are kind of doing is the Canoomans, which are a mix of slavers that worship constellations. How would you describe them?
I wouldn't say they're the big baddies. There's one of the big baddies out there. I would say all the nations are a bit neutral, and like there's no black or white. It's a lot of gray. Everybody's right in their own way, I guess. I guess the big baddie it's the fact that the whole plane is collapsing and everybody's trying to escape or make the best out of it.
Yeah, it's a very abstract idea that we decided to go for what I guess the quote unquote big bad would be. But for Kanuma, itself, though I do tend to write them in a slightly more negative light. In reality, they are a place that's just as desperate as everybody else is, and a little bit more violent than the other city states because violence has been what's working for them so far. But once the book comes out and you go to the other city states like Mur or Batar, or even Tarnak itself, you'll see that in these places you have a smattering of a rogues gallery where there's all kinds of people who could potentially be a big bad or just a villain or even just an antagonist who has their own like good needs, their own things they want for the greater good, but the way they have to go about it in this dying world is just increasingly violent and bad for those around them on a micro level, if that makes sense.
What was the initial idea for the Scavenger setting? Was it your art?
Yeah, I guess so. It started long ago. I don't remember, maybe 3 years ago. I wanted to make like a comic book, but it's a lot of work for just one person. Then I tried to do like just a book of art with just characters and their backstories, because I like to paint the characters. But for that, I needed a bit more story than just like various backgrounds. And I think at some point I contacted Robert, and at that point it expanded and creating more of a setting out of this art. And then we decided to add the D&D rules on top of that, so it's more compelling, I guess.
So Robert got in there, and Robert, when you started seeing this, did you like immediately know that this was a setting you wanted to make for a product, or was it just a cool homebrew setting for you guys to kind of create, kind of riffing off of Alex's art?
So Alex's art, kind of drew me in. We kind of talked about, what he wanted to do, and so he wanted to. His initial goal was kind of like a cool coffee book, of art, like a large book. And so we started talking about that, and I'd had some experiences with Kickstarter and helping people with their Kickstarters, and it's difficult to sort of just sell just a fantasy world without anything behind it. And so we kind of started talking about, well, maybe do we want to add, some role-playing rules? That was something I was very comfortable with. And I'm in a lot of the RPG communities, a lot of D&D communities. And so I knew if we had rules, it's something that we could sell easier than just a book. So we kind of started talking about that, and Alex was open to that. And so then we just kind of started working some rules into it. We decided we were initially going to kind of do the book separately, and then maybe like have a PDF of just rules. And then we were kind of deciding which RPG systems we wanted to use. And so it just kind of was the long process of kind of narrowing it down and just figuring, okay, well, we'll end up doing this great art book. It's going to have a lot of art, but also is going to have some rules in it. And then when Marquise kind of got added to it, we sort of expanded the rule section a little bit, and it's kind of turning into more of sort of like your standard campaign setting for 5th edition at this point. It's a decent sized book with it's just going to have more art than I would say your regular campaign setting book would.
And Alex, you said in one of your blog posts that a big influence from you is Brom. Is that correct? Or Brom?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when I was like a kid growing up in the 90s, man, I remember like seeing his art on these giant posters in comic shops. And it was always like, he's just got the art that makes you wake up weird places of your imagination which you have never traveled to. It's some mix between like mythology and like David Bowie's Goblin King. Like the characters are just skinny and he just draws the best elves. Like, can you speak to like you met him before, didn't you?
Yes. I met him a couple of years ago, I guess, back or something like that, at a art convention. He's an awesome guy and artist, and I love him.
Yeah.
But before Brom, I think what sparkled this was Boris Vallejos. I don't know if you know his name, and Frank Frazetta, of course, were also big names that inspired my art. But yeah, Brom was definitely the one that nailed it.
Yeah, Boris is like the same kind of guy. Like I didn't like I looked him up on your webpage and then I looked up some of his art, and so many books that I had like growing up had covers by him. He really is like very similar. Loves human anatomy, loves things to be just sparkling muscles popping and stuff like this, and does just some really amazing stuff. When you met Brom, did he give you any advice as a fantasy artist?
Yeah, I kind of picked up his brain on where does he look for like inspiration and all that. It's a matter of like whenever you want in a book, just go outside and take a ride, whatever. Doesn't matter. I just love his style a lot. I love how he put a lot of details, and basically when you look at one of his paintings, you just see you can read a lot in every corner of each painting, and yeah, it's a basically world building in just one painting, and I love that part.
Yeah. So Scavenger has a very cool aesthetic to it. Just looking at the characters, you immediately get a feel for what it is you're trying to do for the setting. And, I really appreciate that because nothing tells me that you guys really care about a setting more than great art. And this book has some really great art in it that I really like. So what's going on with this aesthetic?
Thank you. Well, one of the first games I played was Dark Sun for the PC, the first one. And if you look at the cover made by Brom, you understand that world in one image. I try to do the same with each of the pieces of art that I have in the book. But yeah, the Scavenger, it's also got inspired by one of my favorite movies still. It's the first Conan the Barbarian from 1982. It has a different type of aesthetic. It's just like a early stage of civilization world with low magic, low fantasy, that combined with some sort of a Mad Max feel to it. I guess some people called it a Scavenger. It's like a Bronze Age punk. So we kind of like that term a lot.
Very cool. Yeah, and when I was trying to get people to get into Scavenger, I just showed them that cover, and they immediately got a feel for what this game is about and like what it's gonna feel like playing it, which is so useful as a dungeon master to say, "Hey, this is what we're doing here. Just jump on in." Are you exploring some themes in your art?
I try to get inspiration for Scavenger from a lot of ancient cultures, like Mesopotamian, African culture, but mostly like Bronze Age, Assyrian, stuff like that. It's all mixed in there, African as well. Said it's a lot of stuff mashed in there, but not in a kitschy way. Just trying to make an aesthetic out of all of it. We trying to combine like maybe, of course, it is inspired by Dark Sun and Planescape, but we're not trying to copy them. We're trying to make an original setting inspired by those settings.
And there's something really cool about Andy's characters, and this is what originally drew me to his art, is that a lot of his characters have like this real like punk rocker aesthetic to them, like the shaved heads, the really cool like colorful uniforms and everything. And so when you might normally imagine like a knight in shining armor for the adventure or the wizard in the tall hat, or even like the Mad Max dude like wrapped in leather, here you just have these really punk, almost rebellious people who are rebelling against the extinction itself, the great dying, in order to live. And I think that's like a very like implicit and implied theme in Andy's art that I think really just makes adventuring here just like a really, really, really cool to me.
Like looking at Andy's art, the things that really inspired me were his sort of landscape. They're just very epic and magical. I just remember one of them has people sitting around a fire, and there's this like giant, you don't know if it's like a robot or if it's like a statue kind of in the background. And then there's these like motes of light that are just floating about. And it just gives a very mystical, otherworldly feel that I really like.
Yeah, great art goes such a far way into making an awesome role-playing game and immediately getting on your board of what it is you want to do. And I agree. Like, this feels like Dark Sun, but with this new modern aesthetic for it. And then hearing that you're so influenced by Brahm, it really tears it home for me of how like connecting the pieces here to modern RPG games from 80s cool RPG games. So I just love seeing that continuation and that history just flowing through now into this new great awesome setting.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Danger Dungeon Encounter podcast with my guests, the creators of the Scavenger Playtest. So one of the things that's a little bit different about Scavenger is the mechanics of how we approach the 50. And one of the first things that the mechanics go out is instead of having classes, we're thrown into 4 roles. And can someone explain what those roles are?
Yeah, so scavenger roles were my answer to a problem that you see with basically every like third party D&D product and that they have to tackle is that what do classes look like in your new world? Because while the classes in core 5th edition are pretty, I guess not generic, but they're pretty straightforward, they don't work, I think, with the fluff given for every single setting, especially something as unique as Scavenger. So my idea was to take classes and to put them into what's called scavenger roles, because the PCs, the players themselves play as scavengers, and to have each role be something very defined, both in the world and something mechanically. So each role is about 3 to 4 classes or so. You build your proficiencies and your equipment depending on your role, and each role also has some alternative class features for class features that I didn't think and that we didn't think would work as well in Akara and Torn as they do in other 5th edition fantasy products.
Yeah, so depending on what your role is, you get like a limited number of proficiencies and saves that you have to choose. Mm-hmm. So you might get into a position where you're deciding if you're going to take heavy armor proficiency versus getting to save on an intelligence roll or something like that. Which brings us to another interesting point that you guys are doing in the Scavengers Playtest is the way you handle proficiencies. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I was flipping through the Dungeon Master's Guide looking for inspiration when I was working on the rules, and I found this variant rule for ability score proficiency, which I thought was really, really cool. So basically how it works is that instead of having skills, every class, as it works in the Dungeon Master's Guide, offers you 1 or 2 ability score proficiency, so strength, charisma, constitution, or what have you. And you're proficient in any roles that would require those kinds of things. So I took that as a base and I assigned different ones to different scavenger roles. And then if you do end up getting something that would be like a normal skill proficiency, because you can get those some class features or your racial backgrounds or what have you, it gives you essentially double proficiency if you were to roll for that thing.
Yeah, so you actually have the possibility to get rolling double proficiencies for certain things. And kind of like, so when you do this, it almost gives it an OSR style feel because suddenly you're just rolling. The DM is just calling, hey, just roll a strength check for whatever.
Yeah, so a lot of my design stuff has some roots in the OSR, and I wanted to channel some of that just because we have a big focus on exploration and discovery for the Scavenger product. So what I wanted was a way for people to be able to explore the environment with maximum amount of freedom without being tied to certain proficiencies for certain things, and for a more loose feel to it to kind of replicate just kind of like how loose the exploration can be in places like Torn.
Some of the rules, like I really like some of your alternative rules that you've brought into the Scavenger playtest. And if, even if I love this setting and I don't get to play it as much as I want to because other settings get in the way, I really like some of these rules and I'd like to bring them into my home game. I really like one of the rules that you guys use for healing and hit dice. Can you explain that real quick?
So basically, healing is something that is kind of a point of contention for people who like more brutal games sometimes, the 5th edition. There's a rule in the DMG where basically a short rest is 8 hours and a long rest is a week. I looked at that, but I didn't like some of what it did with some of the classes in the game. So I decided to take inspiration from another product, and not another product, another thing I was working on in the past, where basically you can only experience or enjoy the benefits of a long rest if you're in something that a safe place, like a sanctuary. So when you're out there traveling and you're exploring Torn or you're exploring Akara, you're kind of getting worn down by the environment, by the great dying, by the alien nature and everything. and you're getting hit dice at a fewer amount as you're going on. You have to use hit dice in order to heal at all normally, but you also have to use like medical kits and like healing items as well in order to use the hit dice. So now, one, you need more item resources in order to heal, and you can't just take a long rest whenever you want. You have to be in a very safe place. I thought that would help capture some of the brutality that's inherent in the setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Just using those rules, you just get the feeling of like you're beat down from the weather and the world and things like this. And instead of just being able to take a quick rest outside of the dungeon and immediately go back to health, you're having to manage the way that you handle those healing kits. And for healing kits, for people who've like never looked these up, I had to look them up because I'm like, I never use a healing kit in my game. You have 10 uses on them. They cost about 5 gold. In this setting, you have a number of things that you can carry because of the encumbrance system, which we'll get into. But yeah, it actually makes you think of like, hey, how do I want to manage this resource? Maybe one of your players doesn't even have one of these healing kits and you have to give those off to someone. So the healing kit has 10 uses on it. Do you use it every time you roll a hit dice, or just one use for to start rolling any of your hit dice? How do you like to do it?
Right now, it's intentionally a bit vague for the purpose of the playtest. I wanted to see what would happen if you had to use it for every hit die and if you had to use it just for every short rest instead. I'm considering making it for every hit die for the final product, just because of the fact that you have 10 uses for each healing kit. And so I feel like it makes the healing kits a bit more valuable to carry around, but also a bit more scary to lose, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And that's the way I think I would like to play it in my game, because it does make you kind of really consider when you're going to roll those hit dice and make it matter. And also, like, so when we're in a desert setting where the world is trying to destroy you. And one of the most important things is when you're in these settings is to make it feel like everything you carry on you has a point. And you can't just carry a ridiculous amount of stuff. You have to make the hard decisions. Are you going to be carrying your weapons or something that might keep you alive in that world? And so in order to get that theme and that feeling in this game, you guys have kind of done something interesting with the encumbrance system.
So the encumbrance system we're playing with right now, which is I think it's the one system that's the most in flux for what we're working on, is it uses slots instead of normal weights. I decided this for 2 reasons. One, I thought that slots were easier to keep track of. And 2, I really hate math. And to be honest, I want to throw out all the weights and just use slots for things. So that was a little bit of a personal pride issue for that. But the idea is that you have a certain number of encumbrance slots based off your different ability modifiers and everything. And you have carrying containers, so bags, backpacks, water jugs, stuff like that can carry different things and different amounts of things. And so every item is given an item slot. We put them in categories like light weapons or two-handed weapons or armors or rations or what have you. So that way you can easily keep track of them. You keep track of what you have in your containers. And it's very easy to see what you lose when you lose it. And it also creates a punishment sense for the dungeon or game master, where they can attack the character's resources by taking away slots or destroying things in slots instead of just focusing on hit point damage.
Yeah, and as a dungeon master, when I kind of approached the adventure that you guys gave it at the end, I really wish I would have done a better job of using the way that you have to manage your resources when you're traveling, because suddenly you get into this really cool kind of like Oregon Trail style situation where you're making the hard choices of like, how are we going to survive with our food? How are we going to survive in this wasteland? And that's beating us down.
Yeah, so that exactly as you said, that's exactly what I was going for. Also, because of the whole idea of the refugee theme, the things you carry should have some kind of emotional weight, I believe. In the player's handbook, you have this really cool trinket table with 100 trinkets or 50 trinkets it actually is on it. And I like the idea of, as you're playing through your character story and everything, you're constantly weighing the choice of, in your slots, do you want food, do you want weapons, or do you want something of emotional value or something important, something magical, something like that. So it also, in addition to the idea of being beat down, you're also picking exactly what parts of your character's life you're having them move to the new area they're going.
You also handle magic. You have your own flavor for the way that you handle magic, which is very different than a straight fantasy game. So you use shards in this game. Can you kind of explain what it is, what your goal was with those shards and how they work?
Visually, they're like small sanguine crystals. I don't want to spoil everything about their backstory, but as of today, right now in Akara, there is no actual magic. But discovering these shards in Thorn, they brought some of the magic in Akara.
So these blood red stones, these shards, their radiation, as I explained earlier, is kind of like bringing magic into a car, and they can be used as a power source for magic. So essentially, every spellcasting class in fifth edition, they can only cast spells because of the presence of shards in a car, and they've been in a car for about 50 years or so. And in Tarnak, you have these artificers who are using these shards to kind of like create this new like type of science. And in other places of the world, the shards kind of spread out. They're being used in mysticism and rituals. So what ends up happening is that shards themselves directly power your magical spells. So if you have no shards on you, it's very hard to cast magic. And in Akara itself, just because there's so few shards as compared to Torn, you can only cast spells of second level or third level, I believe, or lower, and you can't cast any higher than that. But inside of Torn, where there's more shards and more of that radiation and more of the alienness, the shards are more powerful. What you're drawing on is more powerful. You can cast any school of magic through any spell level.
And I might be understanding this the wrong way. So you can only cast up to a level spell depending on the number of shards you have. So if you only have 2 shards, you can only cast a second level spell.
That was the original system. We're kind of changing it right now in such a way that it's not directly tied to how many shards you're carrying on you, but that if you are carrying shards, you can get back spell slots more easily or get spell slots back as an action, a bonus action, or do some kind of like funky things with your spells. But originally it was you have to, for every spell slot you want to cast, you have to have twice that number of shards on you. And shards are magical items, so you have to be attuned to them. So you can only be attuned to so many shards at a time. So it made it really hard for a spellcaster in Akara to cast spells and a lot easier in Torn. And that aspect we're also keeping for the new system.
So that's an intentional setting that Torn just has more crazy magic and has more magical potential.
Yeah, exactly. Because for a lot of the stories in Akara, we want them to be more human-based stories. You have a lot of interhuman conflict between the city-states and refugees and tribes and all that stuff. Meanwhile, in Torn, you literally just have the skies and the sky's the limit, and just crazy things that boggle the imagination are happening almost all the time.
One of the main inspiration for Torn was the movie Stalker. So I don't know if you know it, but it's just like as a scavenger, just imagine someone going into this place that looks familiar, but it's super strange in the same time.
So one of the rules that I also like that I think is a really cool alternate mechanic here is your climbing rules. And as soon as I read this rule, I was like, I flipped to the bestiary because I wanted to see if there was any huge creatures for them to climb, because I immediately want to like throw some huge creatures to try out this rule.
Yeah, so I play a lot of Shadow of the Colossus because I love climbing things and I love stabbing things that I'm climbing, which is a little bit weird, but I figure that makes for a very fun adventuring story as well. So the idea was that basically you climb monsters, you're making contested checks or sometimes a static check. You climb up these huge things and to basically do more damage to them and have a higher chance of doing damage to them. So in the playtest itself, there weren't any huge creatures. And the short bestiary will be often with the core book. There will be a couple in there for you to use this rule on. And of course, you can bring in your other huge creatures in the Torn from other bestiary books that you own. But the idea basically boils down to you jump on something that's huge, you're climbing on it, it's trying to shake you off as you're climbing on it, and you're trying to get into a good position to just really just stab it until it can't be stabbed anymore. And then you climb to another piece and continue. So good times.
So Scavenger from the pre-gens that we get seems very human-centric, but we do get one additional race, and it looks like there's 2 additional races in the setting. Can you talk about those races and what your goals are with them?
Initially, the idea was that it was going to be all humans, and then Andy had the Kith, one other race, and they're sort of outside of human society for the most part, but they live a lot around Tarnak, so we wanted to kind of include them as an option. And then the Kith are kind of like I explained them as sort of like a mix between like elves and goblins. They're sort of very they're small, they have kind of pointed ears, they are very nature oriented. And then he had another great piece of art that was this kind of 4-armed giant, And so we included them. Those were sort of always on the back burner, and we really haven't done much with them yet. But that's sort of in development of like what their role is going to be in the world. But they're the Morgue.
So we'll get in the core book. We'll get kind of like ideas of how to use them as a player race and stuff like that, more fleshed out.
Right.
Yeah, so we'll have rules for the Kith and the Morgue races for creating your characters with, and also guidelines on role playing them, kind of what the culture's like. For the Kith, I developed them a bit more in the sense that they're very empathetic creatures. They have like a shared empathy, not a shared consciousness or something that crazy, but like a shared empathy amongst their tribes that they can very easily pick up emotions from anything they come in contact with. And then with the Morgue, they're very practical as a people. They don't really communicate a whole lot because I'm kind of playing the idea that the jaws aren't as well formed, so they don't really speak a lot. They call it the Morgue because they're only capable of so many like various sounds with their jaws, but they're very pragmatic, wandering, not full-on warrior race, but just a race that will do what has to be done.
So we'll get into that. Are you guys gonna have an adventure, like a different new adventure in the actual book?
Not with the core book. We won't be bundling an exact adventure like Path of Exiles. There'll be some stuff like roll tables and stuff that you can use to build an adventure, but not an exact adventure with this. So in the core book, we're going to have a lot of tools for you to make your own adventures and your campaigns with. There'll be a mixture of roll tables. There'll be a lot of story seeds and adventure hooks. There'll be treasure tables and stuff like that for you to use to get like resources and stuff out of Torn. Unlike the playtest where we have the Path of Exiles adventure, we won't have an exact laid out adventure shipping with the Scavenger core book. Instead, we'll be using these piecemeal tools to kind of build your own stuff. And in the future, assuming Scavenger is successful, we will be releasing like adventure compilations and bigger form campaigns, stuff like that.
Yeah. And for other people out there who like are thinking about doing the open gaming license or like wanting to become creators and stuff like that, what exactly is the open gaming license and what can you use and what can't you use?
So I'm not a lawyer. And so it's one of those things that, I understand that question. It's like in general, what it means is you can use the base rules for Dungeons and Dragons, but you can't officially say Dungeons and Dragons like in your product. That's why you say, the world's oldest role-playing game or whatever. And so, a lot of that comes down to, Wizards of the Coast doesn't want you to use their IP, like their trademarks when you're making your game. They want it to kind of stand on its own. And so, you can use stuff that's in what's called the SRD, which is the system reference document, which is the core rules of D&D. And so you can use those core rules as long as you don't mention D&D or Player's Handbook or certain things like that. There's a lot of great videos of people. There's actually a guy named Matt Finch who I think is a lawyer, and he talks about the OGL and the SRD and what you can and can't say and what you can and can't use. I would highly recommend people go watch those, but it allows people to create their own settings, their own rules using, our favorite RPG.
So you can't really like bring in like into your book, like feats and spell names and stuff like that. It's just more like core mechanics.
Yeah. So basically if you look, anything that has a name tied to it, like in spells, like Tasha's Hideous Laughter, it's just called Hideous Laughter in the SRD. Mm-hmm. So you can't use any Wizards IP. You can't use Beholders. You can't use Illithids, that kind of thing. But you can kind of create whatever you want. And, you can create anything you want. You can even create stuff that's based on the SRD or that's already included. You just have to like change up the names and kind of write your own text. You can't just like copy it wholesale, except for what's in specifically.
Fantastic. Well, I'd be remiss if I did not ask, how far away are you guys from actually bringing out the core book? Like, when are we going to get that?
Say we're aiming for, I don't want to say a date or a month, but sometime the end of the summer. Hopefully we can make a Kickstarter.
Fantastic. And that's the plan. You guys are going to try to do a Kickstarter for it?
Yes, pretty much.
So what additional things are we going to get in the actual book that we didn't see in the playtester that we should look forward to? And I know it's kind of hard to make crazy promises now 1 year out, but just what are like some of like your like shoot for the moon type dreams for this book?
So they're going to be, it's going to be like a general setting description of Akara, of course, Torn, which is like another world. There will be 4 city-states that will be described in here, the 2 new races, and of course the changes in the 5th edition that we have.
we're going to add Tarnak too. So Tarnak is like kind of the main city state, which is it's going to have a lot more detail of the actual city NPCs that you'll find in different factions. I kind of viewed Tarnak as sort of like that's kind of like even if everybody doesn't start there, that's probably where a lot of adventures will end up starting once the players kind of get there. And then that's sort of like the gateway to Torn, and then that's also they can go back out into Akara, the rest of the world as well. So this, in my mind, there was always like kind of 3 settings that you can play with easily. You can play with the wide world, you can play with Tarnak, or you can go into Torn. So there's all these locations within all 3 of those that we'll be fleshing out more.
Yeah, and with that, so Torn will be a lot more fleshed out than it was in the playtest. It's going to be like exact adventure sites, stuff like that. Gameable things just at the table, a slew of new NPCs to play with. We use a lot of like different narrators that add accents to the sections and all that kind of stuff. And then not all of the rules in the playtest will show up in the core book, and some of them will be in different forms. But of course, you'll have the mechanical changes, and then you'll have a lot of ways to bring in like backgrounds and to create authentic characters of the setting and authentic stories of the setting, and new ways of playing 5th edition that we haven't fully revealed yet, but I think will make Scavenger really sing when it comes out at the table.
Are you getting a lot of good advice from introducing your game as a playtest first? You getting some ideas of things you want to change?
Yeah, the feedback has been very helpful. So it's helped me realize what things I want to focus on for the main book and what things I would want to use for the future if we do decide to pursue the project future. So that's why I said not all the rules in the playtest will show up in the core book, and some of the rules will be drastically different than they are in the playtest. But all will still work for that overarching theme that we've been kind of like working towards as discussed in the podcast.
Yeah, I love it when creators do playtests, so you get a kind of feel for their world. You get to see what their product is, and it's just really cool just to see playtest and help make a product better. So, as from a fan point, thank you guys so much for doing this because I really, really enjoyed it as a product.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So if people want to follow you online or keep an eye out for the Scavenger playtest, where can they do that?
We just started a Reddit. So there's a Reddit for Scavenger. We've got a Discord. We've got Twitter. So you can find all of those at scavengerworld.net, where we post our blogs, and we'll continue to put any other place we're at, any new communities we'll put there.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here for this interview. We really appreciate it. We're looking forward to checking out this product when you finally get to the main book. Gentlemen, we'll keep an eye out on what you're doing. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks, man.
If you like content like this, coverage of all things tabletop role-playing games, interviews with game masters and creators, and game master advice, be sure and keep an eye on this channel. Till then, keep those dice rolling and let's keep on making this stuff up together on the fly.